Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to session 4 of our free webinar series, Maximizing Data Quality and Value and ROI. This is Kevin Askew, Senior Sales Manager of Programmer's Paradise, and today's session is titled Leveraging the CA ERwin API, an Introduction and Real-Life Examples. Today's agenda will include a little bit about who we are as Programmer's Paradise. Then I will turn the session over to Victor Rodriguez for Leveraging the CA ERwin API webinar. A little bit about Programmer's Paradise. We are a leading e-seller of developer and infrastructure tools. You can find us on the web at www.programmers.com. And CA ERwin falls under our database worldview ecosystem. We are an elite CA partner. They're #1 partner when it comes to data modeling, and we have a dedicated CA sales and engineering team on staff. We handle database modeling and infrastructure, design and training services, and we're a leader in delivery of CA education. Under our database worldview, we cover industry-leading tools for your end-to-end database needs, including database platform, design modeling, development and test, management and administration, deployment and migration, performance monitoring and tuning, and reporting and mining. This session is our 4th session in a 5-session series. The session number 5, which will be our last of this year, will be on December 13th. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Victor Rodriguez. Victor.
Thanks, Kevin. So welcome, everybody. I hope you have attended our previous webinars. If not, they are available on demand, and we'll send you further details for anybody who may be curious. For today's presentation, I'm going to try something a little different. If you do have questions along the way, do feel free to ask them, and hopefully I'll see them popping up here in the queue, and I'll answer them as they come in. The presentation today is going to cover the API and how do we leverage that to maximize the data modeling process. The API is going to allow us the ability of rebuilding, of automating some processes within our design environment and pushing out those best practices to our users. Some of the examples we're going to see is the method of populating values into a model from a spreadsheet and allowing us to do any kind of redundant, repetitive process by building API code around that. We'll have real-world examples. I'm also going to introduce you to very good resources where there's already code available and some general strategies on getting your next project in place using available previous examples. So the agenda is going to be covering the topic of what is the API, when should you consider using it, what are these available resources, then an introduction to the VBA development in Studio, which is built right into Excel, so there's no reason to go and build or buy new programming code. If you're just a very casual coder, there is a very convenient method of coding right within the Excel tool itself. Navigating around some of this published code from these available resources, and then some strategies for building our first original project. So the ERwin API. Many of us are probably familiar with the concept of API, Application Programming Interface. It allows, in this particular case, the ERwin API is COM-based, so it allows any kind of COM-based code to access the ERwin metadata and the actual data within the model itself. So you have the access at different levels of the metadata and of the actual data that's encoded within the model. It allows you to access the data within an individual file and also against the Model Manager repository. So there are methods where you can build automated processes where you're extracting files from the metadata, or I should say from the Model Manager repository, or against building reports against that information. What purpose would you have with the API? When could you possibly use this and implement it? Some very common usages for the API are for building reports. Using the API, you can actually extract object types. You can actually start to build reports based on those objects. You can do much more analysis beyond the scope of what's just in the canned ERwin reporting object. Since you have access to full metadata, you can start doing analysis on those objects. You can ask, what is this object in relation to another object? Where are objects overlapping? Where are they linking? What is the relationship between some metadata objects and model objects? You can access multiple models at the same time and generate reports against those multiple objects. You can also, another very useful method is for automating redundant processes. If for some reason we need to go in and turn off the generate option for every single table within a certain stored display or within a certain subject area, if we need to specify that we want our model broken down into subject areas for each discrete schema owner, this is a manual process that can be very time consuming and can have errors. You may forget to add a schema owner as a subject area as a subject area, and then forget to populate it correctly with those members. We can automate this process by using the API to build these projects. So that's what that automated redundant processes bullet point is there. Also, we have the ability of building objects from lists. Many times you may have received a spreadsheet with a list of tables and definitions, of attributes and definitions, data types for those attributes. You may need to build a whole list of new domains, for example, specify data type validation rules and default values dependent on tables, on columns, etc. And you can do a lot of this automation by building a spreadsheet, let's say, and then use some code to populate the model appropriately. So let's take a look at some very useful resources. Let me just share my desktop here. And we'll be moving back and forth between the presentation and my desktop for the remainder of this webinar. So the first place I'd like to show is the actual installation folder for the ERwin Data Modeler. In the doc folder, we'll see that there is, first of all, there is a ERwin API reference guide. This PDF file contains an introduction to all the basic concepts that we're going to be covering today, plus significantly more. You're going to have discussions of what actually can be accessed, what are the methods of generating the code, and most importantly, perhaps, is the fact that there is a complete project that is being built step by step throughout this project. And this code is available in C++ and then also in Visual Basic.NET. So if you're familiar with those programming languages and you'd like to have some code to do each one of the possible tasks, you'll see that you can actually step through the examples for each particular function definition, and there will actually be code there programmatically to access that. Now, of course, like any other development endeavor, it's good to have that code as a reference point, because if you have it once, why reinvent the wheel? We could basically just build off of existing code. So that's the first point I'd like to mention. Also, in this same exact reference guide, if you are migrating code, if you have inherited API code from somewhere else, and you would like to migrate that code to the latest version of ERwin, these API spreadsheets here actually will allow you to, shows you the old property types, the legacy names, and the new mapped values to make that much more convenient, the migration of your code from one to another. The let me go back to my slideshow very quickly. The next resource I'd like to show you is this URL here, which is, this is actually via the support website, the CA support website for the ERwin product. And if we actually navigate there, just a moment here to get to the URL I was trying to specify. If we actually navigate there, we actually go to the main ERwin support page. If you have if you're under current maintenance with the ERwin software, You can access this resource, you can navigate to it from ca.com or just go to support.ca.com and then select ERwin. You can also go to ERwin.com and navigate here as well. The first resource that's available from this is we have a video index. So there's a whole series here of video instruction is very useful. We have, like, for example, many of you may be curious, this is outside the scope of our presentation, but a better understanding of how the complete compare option sets work, and there's a web presentation on this. But as far as our topic goes, there is a video here on the introduction to the API and another one here on a specific exercise, which is the removal of history objects and the CA ERwin API. I will actually be presenting this as part of my webinar, just a few minutes on this. There's more detail here, and this video was actually prepared by myself, so there's much more content in this particular instructed video. There's also available from this same link is the API reference guide, which it just gives us a web-based method of navigating through the API references. And you can see there's typical use case for a standalone client as an add-in, etc. So there's a lot of information here, and we can actually do a search on it. So it's a very useful way to navigate around, if you have a specific question relating to a particular function or something like that. And once again, this is available right from the support page itself as a resource. There's also a page here dedicated to the Exchange server, I should say data exchange, and it appears that I've lost it in my, when I jumped in here. Let me just re-access it here. And here it is here, and this is the Modeling Suite Data Exchange Information Center. Available from here is an API tutorial spreadsheet, which has been built recently and has a decent tutorial here. It's very specific to building entities and attributes, but still, it's a pretty good starting point for any kind of endeavors you may need to achieve. We also have a zip file here containing samples that are written for, I believe this is .NET, the samples were written in, and these are all R7 samples that are available. And there's other documentation here as well. The explanation of how enumeration for the XML tags, etc., exist in the metadata and how they correspond to the underlying API code. This may be a little bit more advanced, but if you do need it, you can have access to this at any time, once again, via the ERwin support page. Another very good resource I'd like to draw everybody's attention to is the ERwin Spy. And this is probably, for my money, well, considering it's free, it's definitely the best tool I have whenever I'm trying to develop any kind of new utilities. This is available, once again, this is just standard with the ERwin install. And let me go back to my desktop quickly. Once again, in the ERwin install folder, if we go to this backup files folder, there is a samples folder, and there's an ERwin API folder. This sample client is actually the code that generates the ERwin Spy, and it's in a VB project, so if anybody wants to drill into it, there's much information there, and this actually gives you access to every single type of model object that's supported. So once you get a little more advanced, this is a fantastic resource for learning exactly how to access anything within the product. But let's just launch the application itself. This is in the ERwin Spy folder, and this is ERwin Spy 7.3.exe. I'm just going to launch that. And we see that we just have this little simple interface here. I'm going to actually open a file from my desktop. Let's just open eMovies, since we're all familiar with that. And what this actually allows us to do is we can see the different meta models for the eMovies model. But by default, we're going to open this within the model object level. So I just double click on this root level here, and we can see that here's a list of all of my entities. And we can see the object type is entity, capital E. Within my entities, I can see all of my attributes. And I can take a look at all the supported properties for that object. These flags tell us whether the object is read-only or not. Read-only objects would not be updatable via the API, but any other properties can be modified. So in this one central location, we can see an overview of the metadata. We can see the metadata in an actual project rather than just theoretically. And of course, it gives us the values for those particular properties. So if we're looking for a particular value, looking for a particular condition, we're looking for perhaps a logical or a true-false flag for executing code on a particular behavior, we can find very good candidates by searching through these, using the API, I should say, or the ERwin Spy to search through the model data. And we'll be coming back to this as we go through our project. The next topic, the next topic I'd like to introduce everybody to is VBA in Excel. If you've installed Excel on your PC, you do have your VBA as basically as a development studio for your code. And let me show you, there's a few considerations, I should say, to take into account. So let's take a look at that quickly. The first pointer, and I'm just going to create a new file rather than looking at an existing project, a new blank worksheet. Okay. The first takeaway is we want to have the developer tab available. And by default, if you have not customized your Excel installation, you are not going to see this developer tab. This is very easy to resolve from the icon up here, the Windows icon, Office button in the upper left-hand corner. We're just going to click on that button. We're going to select Excel options. And then we're going to see all of the available options here. By default, this Show Developer tab in Ribbon is turned off. We want to turn that on. And then we're going to click OK. And from that point on, we will see the Developer tab. Once we have the Developer tab, we see that we have a Visual Basic option here. If we click on that, we're going to see our Visual Studio, our Visual Basic editor. So what are some nice features of the editor itself? Let me open a sample that I took from the ERwin support page. Let's open it from, actually, you know what? Let me open it from the support page itself. I'm just going to do a search here. This is back in the, this is just the ERwin support page. I'm going to do a search for ERwin API. I'm going to do a search for knowledge base articles just by filtering here on knowledge base articles. And let's take a look at this introduction of synchronizing our foreign key code. So this is oftentimes users may want to have their foreign keys and their index names the same. And although these screenshots are not displaying properly, that's okay. What I really want is to get the sample code, which is available here. Let's open that document. Let's go into our Visual Basic Editor. Now in the Visual Basic Editor, we're going to expand the modules section. We're going to right-click on the module which is existing here, and we're going to do a View Code. This is the ERwin code itself that's executing when we want to generate our code. And let's take a look at a better example here, a more recent one, I should say. I apologize for this. This is also available from the support site. But what we want to do here is we say that we want to populate domains from a particular spreadsheet. So here we've defined a few domains, social security number, phone, and car ID. And then we have 3 different data types, domain data types defined for them. Now in this particular case, let's actually execute this code. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to build a empty model for us to work with. I'm going to create a new logical physical model. I'm going to call it, let's just make it a SQL Server model, it's fine. We're going to save this on my desktop. I'll just save it as test1. And now we'll exit this. This is a key point as well. Make sure the model is closed when you're trying to update it. ERwin will not let you, or the API will not let you update a open model, since it would be automatically operates as the system is going to make it a read-only at the time. When we click this Update Domains button, and I go to my desktop, I can now click on that test1 model, and we'll see this button that says Update Complete. If I go back into my ERwin, and I open that same model that I just built, and I look at my domains, I can see in the domain editor that I now have the car ID with its data type defined, the social security number, and the phone number. Now let's look in the code to see what is actually occurring to generate this code. The way we actually step through VB code in the editor itself, there are some very useful methods of actually stepping through the code. So we actually start at the top here. I'm going to use the debug step into, or just the F8 button, if you just want to tap F8, and it'll step through the code. So the highlighted code is the code that is currently active. I'm actually just going to shut down the ERwin model to make sure we don't get failure on execution. So if you want to investigate existing code that already exists, we're just going to open the project in our VBA editor, and we can just tap through F8, and we can see what's happening at each level as we step through the code. So this is actually standard code, and you can actually just create a template that contains this as its body. We're going to create an SC app, and we're going to create an object of type AllFusion SC API. I'll hit F8. And we see that now, if I mouse over a value, whenever I mouse over a variable, the current value of it is displayed. So now that I've populated this as an ERwin model, I see that the SC app contains a CA ERwin data model. I'll hit F8 again, and this is just using Windows Standard File Picker for populating the file editor. And if I just tap through a few of these, eventually I'll be prompted to select the file again. This takes me back to the code, and if I look at this assignment here, string file name right now is currently empty, but if I tab over, it is now populated with the full path that I just selected from the editor. Here's where the ERwin code actually begins. Up until this point, we've simply been using the file picker to populate the model, to actually basically pass the ERwin file data into the API. But here's where our code actually begins to execute. The first thing we've done here is we've created an application model object, and we've assigned to it the file that I just passed in there. And I'm just mousing over that to show you the path to the file, which is now being assigned to this object. I'm going to add a session. This is also standard. Once again, we can just build a template or use an existing file that has this header file code in it. And at this point, we have now assigned the model to this root object. This is an important point when we're collecting any kind of objects. What we've done is we need to specify at what level we want to collect objects. So for example, we can actually specify that we want to collect all attributes in the entire model, or perhaps just the attributes in a particular entity. If that's the case, we would specify that explicit entity as our root object. However, what we're doing here initially is assigning the entire model as our root object. This will collect everything that exists within that model at the root level. Now, the next two steps here is we're actually using just the spreadsheet API itself to populate the domains tab of the spreadsheet. We're opening a transaction just using this begin transaction code. A transaction must be open to actually modify. You can run reports without changing the data with no transaction being open. However, when we're going to actually be populating or changing the data within a model, you must have a transaction open. By default, we're going to use a do-while loop for this coding. So we're just going to say do-while more is greater than or equal to 0, and of course we're going to make more 1. So by default, we will execute this at least one time. We're going to increment more by just adding 1 to it, and now we see that more is equals 2. And the reason we're doing this is just to tab over to the A2. Basically, we're just building a counter so that we can move through the spreadsheet. So our first spreadsheet value will be A2. We're going to take the string that's actually typed into the spreadsheet and assign it to this string, the domain name. And if I mouse over there, we see that the domain name is now assigned Social Security number. If the string domain name is blank, this is just an error code here to make sure that if we get to the end of the list, we exit. So by making more -1, we're going to exit out of this loop and finish our code execution. But in this case, it's not. We actually have a valid string value here, Social Security number. So we're going to jump to the else statement. We're going to move through the cell. This is still at A2. We're going to take the value from there. We see that it's empty initially, but now we've populated it with char 9. So this is the value that we're going to use to populate that value. And we continue to step through after we've populated the values from the spreadsheet. Now in this case, we already have, we'll notice that this bit of code here was skipped because I've already built the domain in this project. But normally what we're actually doing here is that we would actually take the domain value, the name assigned to it, which is the Social Security number, which I'm just mousing over there to show you, the logical data type and the data type, to assign these values to the object of domain. This should have an underscore. To actually assign this value to the domain itself. And by doing so, it will actually build that object within the model. And the way that we're doing that is by we're setting the object equal to, or we're using the add function, and the add function allows us to add objects, and then we specify the type of the object. The type of the object is going to be domain. And then we specify some properties for it. Name is required. That's pretty much the only property that's required for the domain. And we can assign these values to the code. And then we just continue to step through. We exit one if loop, exit the next. Now, once again, we return to the beginning of the while loop because there are multiple values within our domain definitions. We'll step through another loop, and we'll go through a third one. And once again, let's just review some of these values now. We'll see that we're now at A4. The value being assigned there is car ID. The value is not blank, so we will not exit the loop yet. We're going to populate. We're going to select the string cell is going to be B4 for the value. This piece of code here, by the way, which I've been skipping over up until this point, is just a cleanup. It removes any kind of non-character data from the names in case someone may have copied pasted your data from one Excel spreadsheet into another or from another application, and it may have hidden characters which do not parse correctly. So we're just removing any kind of strange characters using this, this code here. And this is standard VB, by the way. This is not ERwin specific at all. We're going to assign the object here of domain type. Once again, if this value was unpopulated, if the domain did not exist, we would execute this code. However, it does. And now in this last iteration, I think this is the last one. So we may exit right here. There we go. So we exit the end if because we did have a blank value. We only have 3 domains defined. and now we exit the loop. And now the rest of this is just some cleanup. We're committing the transaction. If we don't commit at this point, it's in memory, but it hasn't actually been stored to the model itself. So we've actually changed it. We're ready to save it to the model. We're going to close the open session, and now we're going to actually do the save here. If the model was currently open, it would fail at this point during the save, but it's not, so the save is successful. We get an update complete message box, and that's this piece of code that just executed here, and we end our subroutine. And then once again, back in the model, when we open that test1 model, we'll see those domains. So this is a method where we can actually just receive a spreadsheet where you may have had all your domains defined, and now you actually have the ability of populating it from from that spreadsheet. So now you can have the ability of having your non-data modeling team write a spreadsheet, populate it, and give you those values. There are a bunch of examples of this available from the CA website. They contain the ability to define domains, the ability to add definitions to existing tables, or build new ones. Let's take a look at another example here. Take a look at, here we go. So here we have an example of a code that will actually either create or update entity and table definitions, and update or create attribute and column definitions. The method that we're going to be using is to populate one tab with our entity names, entity definition, and table comments, and a separate attribute tab, which always has to be prefixed with the entity name, the attribute name, and then the attribute data type. If we actually execute this right now, I'm going to create an empty ERwin model. I'll make this a SQL Server 2000 model. I'm just going to save this as empty. And what we're going to execute is we're going to execute this update entity table definitions and comments against the table empty, or the model empty, I should say. And I'll also update the attribute spreadsheet against the exact same one. Let's open that model and take a look at it now. And we'll see they're stacked up here, but up in the upper left-hand corner, we have our two models built. Now let's say that I actually want to promote my department ID as a primary key member, my employee ID as a primary key member. I may want to build a relationship from employee to department, or department to employee, I should say. Let's make that a non-identifying relationship. And actually, let's save that model. And now let's close it out of the ERwin software. And back in our project, let's say that we've now received some updates here. We have a new table that's been added, which is a customer. And a comment for that customer. And now let's use the same format. We're going to add a couple of attributes for the customer. And we'll have it as cust ID and name. Let's also give some more usable data types here. These data types are not very realistic here. Let's say the department we have a char for as a standard for our department ID. And let's say that all our employees actually follow the same standard, all the IDs, I should say. Oh, mistyped that. It should auto-populate. It was just my mistyping it that did that. Customer ID will also have this standard char4. The description could have a var char 125, let's say. Social security number would be a char 9. Last name could have be a var char 20. And the customer name could be a var char 40. And let's also put some, quickly update these comments here. And maybe we'll leave some of these blank. Now let's execute the same code. We'll update the entity using the empty model, update complete, the attribute using the empty model, update complete. And now let's open that same model up and take a look at the behavior. Now we see that the two models, the existing models, are still here. Here's our new customer table. And we'll see that if we actually go into the object properties, that where the definitions have been modified, we should be seeing those changes to the comments here as well. Here's the definition we built for this. And we should also see that now our column data types are now showing char4 rather than that varchar 122, which was not a very good data type for any kind of ID code. So what we've done here is this is giving us the ability to update that as well. So how is this happening within the code? Let's take a look at let's cycle through the code one time and see what's occurring. And we'll see that very similar to the previous example. Let me just make sure I'm in the right code set. And we'll see that we're going to do the update entity, which is a simpler piece of code. The attribute code is a little more complex if you do go through this on your own after the our session. You'll notice that the attribute actually is a cause, or should say, it requires that you collect the objects from within an entity, because obviously your attribute can have the same name in multiple entities. So it's a little more complex. So for the purposes of our exercise, we're just going to be stepping through the code here in the just for the entity level. Let me make sure my ERwin is shut. The model is closed, which it's not, so that my code executes correctly. And if we step through here, once again, identical to before, like I said, we can actually build a template file that contains this code. We're going to use the the built-in file picker from within Microsoft to build the population editor here, which is about to pop up. We're going to select the file. Once that's populated, we'll see if I just mouse over, I do see that the full path to my file is specified. Once again, this is just being handled by Windows, the class library. We're going to populate this with the value there, which is just our current model name. We're going to add a session to this. We're going to open a session. Once again, you must open a session to make modifications to the model. We're going to populate the root object or the collection object at the root level. Our object collection currently is empty, but if I tab to the next execution, I've now populated it with the current model. Similarly to what we saw before, we're once again selecting this entity definition, which is simply the tab within our worksheet. And now finally we get into the ERwin code itself. We're going to begin the transaction. We're going to, once again, execute the code at least once because we're making more equal to 1, and we're executing whenever more is greater than or equal to 0. We're going to increment, and this is when we start stepping through the code in the spreadsheet. So we've already populated it. The cell value of A2 is department. Similar to what we saw before, we're going to clean up the string values. Once again, we see that this comment is empty, but we populate it here. And as we just keep, and this is once again just clicking F8 to step through the code one step at a time. By default, I'm creating a new model object. I'm setting it equal to nothing. And then I'm going to try to collect the object. Whenever we do a collection, we take the entire root object collection. We specify a particular item. We could also collect a whole group of objects, by the way. In this particular case, though, we were looking for one explicit item. The item is defined by the string that we've just collected, and then the object type. The object type always has quotes, and it's identical to the name that we see in the ERwin API. So the type of object is entity. Once again, if this is an empty object, we will execute this bit of code here. In this case, this is already populated, but this, if we look at the actual code, we'll see this is where we were assigning. If we're creating the object for the first time, we're going to add that object, and then we're going to populate it with the entity name and with the type of object it is, and then the definition as well, which is actually commented out, but if we wanted to, we could have populated these values, but we're updating the comment instead, which is simply the physical representation of the same string. That's the end of our code. And then we can just continue to loop through that code. And we're just stepping through it for each one of the tables to see whether the object exists or not. Like we mentioned before, like we saw before, if the objects already exist, they're ignored or skipped over. But if the objects do not exist, then they are being built new, and then the update completes. So hopefully that kind of gives you just a basic overview of what's already out there, how to navigate the code, how to see what you can do, what's available within those available codes. We use F8 to step into the code. Mousing over any of the values will actually show the value that's currently assigned to those values. If it doesn't populate and you're expecting a value there, that can be an indication of a problem in the coding itself. And also there's the ability to show class functions in the editor. And I'm going to actually show you that in this last bit of it, where we're going to build a very small sample model. This is actually available from inside of, once again, from the ERwin support page. And we're going to build this project here. Oftentimes, you may have very large models that may have grown to huge sizes because of the amount of history objects that are being collected within there. Although this can be filtered out, it can't be filtered out after the model's already been built. So what we actually have is a simple project here. We're going to count the number of objects and then make a tiny modification to show you how you can actually delete all of them. So first, let me show you the finished product. Oh, I'm in the wrong place here. Let me go back into my VB editor and stop my code break here. And now we're going to execute this. I'm going to select a model. Let's just select eMovies, a relatively small model, and we'll see that there are 218 model objects. Now, by clicking the Remove All History Objects, which I'm not going to do until we've rebuilt this, is we're going to actually clean out the model of all of its history objects. This would be useful if you have, like I mentioned before, you may have an enormous legacy model that may have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of history objects, making the model very large. And in one shot, you can quickly clean that out if you want to kind of start with a clean slate and make the model sometimes up to 50% smaller. So let's take a look at building this from scratch. I've actually built a template here. Let me close down what I have open. And I'm going to open my template file. I'm getting an error message here because I've intentionally left my template definition to be incorrect here. I need to specify a valid code name or name for my the execution of the code here. So we're actually going to call this history. We need to make sure that we have the, I'm sorry, we do have a question. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me, I just heard that my desktop's not showing. Let me go back to my presentation here. Okay. Hopefully everybody can see me now. Apologize for that. So I've built an API, I built a template file, and what this template file has, it just contains the ability, it has already built in the code for opening a session and specifying the file name. So this is going to be repeated over and over again. We also have the ability to do a file save at the end and a close. So once we've built this one time, there's no reason to go and build this over and over again. So we'll start from this template state. We're going to give it a useful name, like we're going to call this history items, and we should rename this obviously to make it a usable name that we can reference later if we need to share, if we want to reuse our code, or simply just to have more transparency when we're actually reviewing our code at some later time. So I've actually written the code here, and I want to step through it one line at a time and show you exactly what we're going to do. The first line of code we're going to write to build our counter. Oh, and before we go any further, I actually want to make sure, and this is actually a very important part of this, is from the tools references, we have to make sure that the ERwin API has been made available to the library of objects. And as we see here, I actually forgot to include it, so that's a good thing I remembered. But just for future reference, we want to make sure that this option is turned on. This is simply telling us what library objects are available to be used, and we want to include the CA ERwin data modeling script client, and the file itself, and we can see the path down here, is the eal.dll. So we want to make sure that's turned on. We're going to click OK. And now let's start building our code. So the first thing I do is I do a dim, which simply is defining a variable. I'm going to call it OHistory. This is what I'm calling it on my own. Just put this O. This is just a kind of a standard naming convention I use, as scapy.modelObjects. Now, if we're curious to see what objects are available, first of all, let me rewrite this to show you. Scapy is simply the API class. If we want to know what type of objects are available, I hit the dot, and we'll see from this list here, I can actually specify exactly the different kinds of model objects. If you're curious about any of these, all of these different model objects are specified and defined within that API reference guide. Model objects, and there's a model object and model objects are the two most commonly used, but obviously they're just creating objects that are going to reside within the model, or you're going to populate them with the values from an existing model object. The next thing I'm going to do, I'm just copying and pasting this from my previous execution, is we're going to set a value. So we're setting OHistory, which is the value we just populated, and we're going to collect objects to populate it with. So once again, we're going to select the O session, which is the session that was populated with the ERwin object itself. .model objects. This contains all the model objects. And if I put a period here, we could see that I have all these different functions that I can use. Once again, these are all available since we've referenced the ERwin API. And I'm going to do a collect. Now, to know what values I need for the collect, I can just do an open parentheses. And we'll see right away it's specifying that I need to specify a root object, a class ID, depth, etc. In this particular case, I'm just going to copy this from what I have. I'm actually starting at the OSESH root level, which is the root level of the model, which is what I specified previously. And we're collecting objects of type history information. Now, how did I know that history information was the type of object that I wanted to collect? We can actually go into any object, and we'll see that there is history information objects for each one of them. So if we're ever curious to know, I want a particular type of object, but what is that object called from the API level. Not only is it documented in the reference guide, but by using the ERwin API, we can see the objects themselves or the type of objects that are being collected. So at this point, I've collected my code. Now, the easiest thing to do is I can actually just do a debug. Debug is just going to print out to this immediate pane down here below. And I need to specify something to print out to it, so I'm going to do debug debug.print. And what am I going to print? I'm going to do the O history. And I'll just hit dot again here, and you'll notice I can do an add, etc. But there's also count. So very quickly, if I execute this code against my eMovies model, I see 218. So this value is the actual count of objects that I've just returned. And this is just 3 lines of code that now generates the count for those objects. Now, if I want to update this, and let's actually do the modification here in this live session, that we're actually going to and delete those objects using the same code that, creating the same code that we had before. I'm just going to copy this entire bit of code. I'm going to create a new module here. I forget how here we go, insert module. I actually forgot how to do that. Let's just paste it in here, and we're going to actually do delete history, or history delete, let's call it. So we know how to collect the items, so how are we actually going to delete them? It actually only requires a couple more lines of code. So we've already dimmed the history objects. I'm going to do one more definition. It's going to be for an individual object. And I'm going to call that object OItem, and we're going to create a scapy.modelObject rather than objects, and that simply is going to be one value for the objects collection. I still need to do the exact same bit of code. I need to collect all of the available objects. And now I'm going to actually iterate through each one of them. And I'm just going to use for each to do that. So for each OItem, which is an individual model object, inside of the collection of history items, I'm going to execute something. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a remove. Now, the first thing I need to do is I want to capture the unique ID. Every single ERwin model object has a unique ID, and I actually want to capture that object ID. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to collect the OItem within the OHistory collection. I'm going to assign hist ID is just a string, and I'm going to assign the object ID string to the item itself. I'm going to begin a transaction. Once again, like we saw in the previous exercise, you must always begin a transaction to be able to make changes to the live model. And then what I want to do is I want to see what available objects or what available functions exist in the OHistory collection. If I actually go OHistory dot, I'll see that I have the ability to remove. And what values do I have to specify for remove? I need to specify the object itself. And of course, I've already collected the object ID, which is this history ID value up here. And it's complaining because I haven't finished the statement, but that's okay. I'm about to finish it now. And now I've specified the history ID. And now I'm just going to commit the transaction. So that's really, literally, other than opening and closing the transaction, we're collecting the items, we're iterating through them using a for each, we're collecting the ID number for that object, and then simply saying remove it from the collection. So here's the collection, remove it, and here's the value I want to remove. And we do this for every single one, which of course is going to remove all of them. I just need a next statement. And let's see if we execute this. Hopefully, if I didn't make any typographical errors, we can run it against eMovies. And now, if I do the, let's go back to my previous tab, and I'm going to execute this. This was the count. Let me clean out my editor down here. I'm going to execute the history items. I'm going to select the eMovies model. and now I only have one history item. So the others have been removed. We have one history item, which is simply the at the root level, the model history itself. This is a very simple example. I just wanted to show that you can build something very usable using just a handful of lines of code. And you can build on this. You may want to strip out table spaces for a physical a database that you now have to assign new table spaces for, and you don't know which ones you have updated, which ones you haven't. So you can very easily go in, wipe out all the table spaces using almost identical code from what I just defined here for the history items. You may be able to just want to go within a particular object and then remove a particular property from that object. So you may want to keep the tables but not the table spaces, keep the tables but not the attributes, or keep your tables but not your indexes, let's say. And the code is very, very similar. You're going to, once again, just collect objects of a certain type, and then you can either report on them, like we did with the counter, or we can actually remove them. You can also add them, like we saw in the first exercise. So that's pretty much what I had as far as the demonstration goes. And I just want to kind of discuss when you're actually building your actual model, what considerations to have when you're building the projects. The first is, most importantly, and this is the case for any kind of development, is you should definitely think about what are you trying to achieve with your with the execution of the code. What is the end result that you want, and what is your starting point? So what does your model look like now? What do you want to achieve in the end? Secondly, use simple models. Oftentimes there may be huge models that you're trying to test against. They have corruptions in those models. You execute your code. You may be having problems, but it's not with your code at all. It's with the model itself. So when you know what you want to do, when you know what your beginning and end point is going to be, build a very simple model with just a little bit of data. As you build that model, add new data. It's very simple to navigate through it using the ERwin Spy, and you can see the relationship between your objects. Oh, I see there's some new tags when I add a foreign key relationship, for example. You can see how the model changes, and then you can get a much better understanding of how the metadata is, but also how your code is going to interact with it. Oh, we do have a question?
In ERwin Spy, what do the columns mean? Please explain.
In the ERwin Spy. We have a question asking in ERwin Spy what the columns mean. What we're seeing on the left-hand side, and if you're familiar with the complete compare, you've probably noticed in the complete compare you have the upper pane. Oh, I'm sorry. I keep forgetting to share that with you all. No. Let me just close that down. In the ERwin Spy, we're probably most of us are familiar with the complete compare with the ERwin itself. And you've probably noticed when you're doing a complete compare that you have the upper pane and lower pane that you're looking at. The upper pane shows you your the objects themselves. So these are the objects that exist in the model. They could be an entity or a table, for example. So those are the objects that are being created as objects in ERwin. Those objects contain properties. And you'll notice in the lower pane, you would see, for example, the physical name on your table, or whether it's a primary key member or not, or whether the value can be nullable or not. These are properties which appear in the lower pane. And that's pretty much the way that this ERwin Spy interface works. When you're looking at the model objects, they're on the left-hand side. So the entity object, or this is conceptually like the physical model, of course, corresponds to the entity. Within the entity, attributes. Within the entity, also key groups and history objects. So these are all objects that reside inside of the entity object, and then there's a whole bunch of other objects, of course, too. And now in the right-hand pane, if I select the entity, for example, I can see here all the properties. So once again, this would be the lower pane in the complete compare. If I want to know what is the definition on this object, what is the name of this object. Here's the long ID. This is the unique identifier. If at any time you need to access this, we definitely need that for the API, but even for your own interest, if you're ever curious to know how ERwin tracks those objects, it's using these unique identifiers. The owner path, like what object owns this current object, what type of entity is it, and these other properties as well. They have relationship references, etc. And these objects are properties, and they're properties that are owned by the objects themselves. So let's take a look at the attribute, for example. And similarly, we're going to see all the properties that are valid within the attribute itself. So some of these are things were very common that we just saw during our exercise today. For example, the physical name, let's say, the domain reference, etc. Oh, so these flags, I think the question is regarding these flags. So the flags actually mention, this is actually documented in the API reference guide. It's in Chapter 1, by the way, which covers the entire ERwin Spy. But just to introduce them, the RO, which is this flag here, indicates whether a value is read-only or not. The DR means the value is derived. So for example, let's take a look at one of these derived values. This is the employee first name. The reason it's a derived value is in ERwin, oftentimes when you've built an attribute or an entity for the very first time, you'll notice that that object has inheritance back to, for example, the physical name is inheriting from the parent name, or I should say from the logical name. So there is this is a derived value. So when you have these derived values, these flags are indicating these behaviors. This is a read-only. This is a derived value. Some of this is API specific. We don't really have to concern ourselves with. Usually you're looking at whether a value is derived or not, and you can check for flag values on that. There's a Boolean value for whether a value is set or not, and that's a whole other section of the API. But you can definitely do a filter on conditions, and that's where you would want to use these. These are basically flags. In other words, each one of these represents a bit at the highest level, and those bits can be queried on, and then you can use a filter against them to execute code. So it's a more advanced concept, but it is something that you may want to use. Like, for example, you may want to execute code depending on whether a column has been name hardened or not, and that is possible using some of this more advanced options. And you really do want to be filtering on these the bits here to get an idea of what the behavior of those individual properties are. So in real basic terms, once again, this is the object level in the left-hand pane. The right-hand level, these are the properties assigned to that object. And then this is the flag, the settings for that object. Once again, whether it's derived or not, whether it's a read-only or not, and some of the other more advanced settings as well. And we have another question. No, I'm sorry. Well, let me repeat the question. Is that they wanted to know? Someone wanted to know whether creating a foreign key ID will automatically build the relationship. Is that basically it? No. It's yes and no. If you build the index object by itself, one of the required objects for that index object for a foreign key object would be, and let me show you. Actually, I can show you rather than discussing it here. In our employee table, do we have any foreign key indexes? Yes, we do. Good. For a primary key index, when you build one, you'll see that, for example, you have the primary key member. You have a dependent object. In this case, it's a relationship line. However, when you build the primary key, you do not require to build a dependent object because the primary key can exist without one. However, when you build a foreign key, the foreign key has a relationship reference, and that's this value here. So basically what happens is that when you build a foreign key, you need to have a relationship reference to an existing relationship, and then you can build and then it will populate. So when unlike a primary key, you need to actually have a reference object as well. So it would be not only building a physical name and a foreign key and the membership, but also the relationship reference. This is the difference, basically, once again, between the properties in the PK membership, which has no relationship reference, and the FK members, any of them, which do have a relationship reference. So that is required when you're building the object, and then that will bring that information. I have a sample project, and if anybody wants to know it, just contact me after the webinar, where you basically have on the right-hand side, like you have your parent tables. On the left-hand side, this is in a spreadsheet, I should say, you have like your parent table, relationship name, child table, and foreign key. And then with just those 4 pieces of information, you can build your relationships via that spreadsheet. But so the answer to that is just building a foreign key is not going to automatically build a relationship. You need to have the relationship object and then basically add it as a reference to the object itself. But that's not too complicated to do based on just existing reports that you may have laying around. Are there any other questions? Okay. So let me just wrap up, and there will be another moment at the end here where I will ask for questions, but so if anyone has to think of any here, we can definitely go back to that. So really quickly, when you do build your own projects, remember that once again, what are you hoping to achieve? What are your starting and end points for your the code itself? Use simple models when you're actually testing the code. When you're building the code, it's definitely better to use a smaller model first before you try it on a large production model. You definitely want to back up your models before you make any live changes to them, obviously. And then use your resources. Use the ERwin Spy to, for example, based on the question I just received where someone wanted to say, okay, I want to build a foreign key. Rather than just building the foreign key, what I would have suggested in that particular case is let's take a look at a particular foreign key like I just did in ERwin Spy. What makes that foreign key behavior different than the primary key? The difference is that there's a relationship reference. So then we think to ourselves, okay, I need to build a relationship reference as well, so I need to build my relationship first. By the way, in response directly to that question, let's say I build my parent table, my child table, and the relationship object. That relationship object will automatically create a foreign key. The foreign key will not create the relationship because ERwin can build an index without a relationship. However, when you build a relationship in ERwin, it will bring indexes with it. So that behavior is true. If you build your relationships, you're automatically going to generate a foreign key index. Lastly, use your resources. Use the ERwin Spy, like I just mentioned, for example. Also, is there sample code already available? Look at what is available on Support Connect. Do a search on available API code. Look at all the links that are available on the ERwin page. Go to the user forums. It's very useful. Oftentimes, people will have problems writing code. They go to the user forums. They post their code out there, and they ask any suggestions. And within a day or so, somebody will come back with something. Also, is there code already available? If there's a project that is doing almost exactly what you're trying to do, build on an existing piece of code. There's no reason to go and rebuild everything on your own. So always start with use your published code as your starting point. So in conclusion, via the API, you can build a code to automate processes. You can add, update object properties, delete existing objects, and update or add objects based on conditions. You can build reports on the model and meta-model objects, and something that's beyond the scope of this is doing analysis on those objects. We touched on it briefly, but using those flags, we can see where are my names being hardened, where are objects derived, where are they not derived. So you can now, doing beyond the scope of just reporting on the objects, we can see the relationship between the settings on those objects and relationships between different objects in different levels of the model. Use your available resources when you're building your projects. The API is COM-based language. People have built Java wrapper classes to use this, but by default, definitely the easiest method is to use any kind of COM-based language. And everyone has access to the VBA or VB script also. If you just want to write some VB script embedded into an HTML file, that will work as well. So those are a very easy starting point. You don't need to break out a large development suite to start playing with the ERwin API. So I hope that was useful. If anyone wants to contact me, you can reach me via email at ca.erwin@programmers.com. You can, my blog is maximumdatamodeling.blogspot.com. My Twitter address is @maxdatamodeling, and my LinkedIn group as well, which is kind of a long URL there. But if you reach out to me in any of the other forums, I will get you that LinkedIn information, so you can join my LinkedIn group. The only last thing I'd mention is we're also going to continue to have another webinar, to continue this series, I should say. We're having another webinar next month. We should have a giveaway at that time, just in time for Christmas. So tell your friends, and hopefully we'll have some gifts for some of our participants. That's going to be discussing customizing the forward engineer template file so that you can actually build any kind of custom SQL into the product so that you don't have to rebuild it each time. You can just create a template that you can reuse whenever you need. And that's going to be our next topic. And I hope that everybody had a good response to this one. But if there's any further questions, please let me know. Are there any questions?
Okay, while we're waiting on questions to come in via the chat, we just wanted to go over again how you can contact Victor or contact our dedicated CA team here for product upgrades, free trials, white papers, in-depth training with Victor. You can be contacted at, again, ca.erwin@programmers.com, which we found on the web at www.programmers.com/ca. And as Victor stated, all of the webinars in this series are available on demand at www.programmers.com/ca. And you could also register for the final one for this year at the same link. And there is some information more towards Victor's blog. So let's just check to see if we have any. We have a question, Victor, from Suzanne. Where can you download the ERwin Spy from?
The ERwin Spy is available. It's actually installed with as part of your ERwin. As the standard ERwin install actually has the ERwin Spy in it. So if you've installed ERwin, it's in your directory. Let me actually just share my desktop just briefly. Oh, actually, I don't have access to it. I apologize. But if you go into Program Files, CA. Oh, hang on a second. I do have access to. I'm going to show you my desktop just for a moment there, just to show you where you can actually access it. The ERwin Spy, once again, it's in the Program Files directory where you've installed your ERwin, whichever version it is. Mine is 7.3. And this exists all the way back to 4.1.4, by the way. So if you're on 7.0 or 7.1, you can also access this. And the 8.x, if you're in the beta process right now, also has its own API language, and these samples should be valid there. So once again, from the install folder, go to Backup Files. You can go to the Samples folder, ERwin API, and then there's a folder called ERwin Spy. And there's an executable here. That's what I've been showing you. There's also an add-in that you can run, and if anybody has questions about that, there's instructions on adding the add-in to ERwin itself, and it will appear. I think I've already added mine in. Let me quickly open a model. And here we go. So I've already had the ERwin Spy here, and you'll see that this will actually launch ERwin Spy from right inside of my open session. So that's the other alternative. And so anybody can run this as a standalone. Just double-click on the erwinspy.exe, and that'll launch it for you. Anybody who wants to actually install it as an add-in, there are instructions in the docs folder of your ERwin install. Once again, Program Files, CA ERwin Data Modeler /doc. In the API reference guide, there are instructions in section 1, not only introduction to the ERwin Spy, but instructions on how do you actually can install the add-in, which is this DLL right here. And then that way, more conveniently, the navigating to this executable, you can just launch it from right inside of ERwin, I should say. Do we have any other questions?
Okay, it doesn't seem like we have any other questions. Again, thank you all for attending the webinar, and all of the contact information is up there to contact Victor or to contact us at Programmers. Again, it is www.programmers.com/ca. Thank you all for attending.